APHA in Huntington for having me, and thank you all for coming. I'm very passionate about this topic. Hope to share some of that passion with you this afternoon. My name is Rob, and I am going to be speaking about secret engraving marks and other mysterious printing on postage stamps. You should have that packet. If you did not get one, check the seat next to you. And if you see some extras, you want to take one for your kids or something, that's fine. If you did get one, I have a few extra in my pocket, and just see me later, I'll be glad to give you a packet. You don't need one to appreciate the talk. However, it's October, and October is National Stamp Collecting Month. And the stamps I want to thank, they're actually not from my collection. They are from the Postal History Foundation in Tucson, Arizona. If you're ever in Tucson or from that area, please be sure to visit them. It's a wonderful place. They provide stamps for educational purposes and talks like this, and so I'm so thankful to them. You should have 2 or 3 stamps in your packet, as well as my business card, and the stamps we'll be talking about in just a few minutes. So, I want to start with this stamp because it's right after lunch and you might be thinking of dessert. So this stamp, this is a stamp. It looks like a piece of chocolate, but it's a really cool stamp. It was put out in 2001 by Switzerland to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the chocolate industry. And they wanted to do it up, and so they made it look like a piece of chocolate. But it gets better. It gets better. The printer, not on the printer's on machinations, but because of the contract, actually coated the stamp with a lacquer with little scent globules. So when you smell the stamp, it smells like chocolate. Now, unfortunately, when you lick the stamp, oh, and by the way, for those of you who are very young here, you may not remember, but the rest of us remember, you used to have to lick stamps on the back to stick them on an envelope. Now, of course, they're peel and stick. But this stamp was a lick and stick stamp. And unfortunately, when you looked at it, it did not taste like chocolate. They forgot about that. That would have been really, really cool. But it gets even better than that, because if you bought a pane of these stamps, they made it look like a chocolate bar with a foil wrapper around it. So this all got me thinking a couple things. One, why would a government, a country, whatever, really go through all the problems and trouble to make a stamp like this? The cost, the exorbitant production. Why not just say, Switzerland postage, first-class postage? And so it got me thinking about that. It got me thinking about the history. Is this something new, or is this kind of thing been going on where maybe sort of secret, interesting things have been on stamps for quite a while? So we will answer both of those questions in this talk. But first, a little history. So those of you who are stamp collectors or maybe collected stamps when you were young probably recognize this stamp. Considered the first postage stamp. This is from 1840 in Britain, and this is called the penny black. That's Queen Victoria on there. She's now, in 1840, she's in her 3rd year of reign, so it's the young Queen Victoria. And postage stamps came about for a number of reasons. One was because people were sometimes sending letters with postage due on receipt. And what would happen is that you might get the letter and say, you know what, I don't really need this. And then you would just tell the postman, no, it's okay, I don't want to pay for it. So that was one of the reasons. Also, by making it a penny, it made it very advantageous and really promoted communications, reading and writing in Great Britain at the time. This took off in a few years around the world, as we'll see. Although I'm going to focus primarily on Great Britain and America in this talk. A couple of things about this stamp. You'll probably notice the neat engine turnings on the side. This stamp was engraved, was done on a flat plate press, and most stamps in the U.S. were done, in the U.S. and in Great Britain, were done on a flat plate press for about, well, probably until about the 1870s or 1880s, and then they were done on the like the 4-seat flat plate press. And of course, that's when things got mechanized by steam or by electric. And then they used those for about another 40 or 50 years. When you get into the 1930s and 40s, things get kind of complicated. The machines get really big, and they start adding the gum and the perforation. So we won't get into that too much. But this stamp was engraved, line engraved, and also you'll see on the bottom 2 little letters, M and H. And different stamps had different letters on them in the bottom. And I'll show you how that was done. You see here, you'll see, this is just a kind of a close-up of 6 of the stamps in the middle of the sheet. And you'll see there's an LD on top, and an LE and an LF, and then the bottom, MD, ME, and MF. That's because as you go down, the letters would get higher, and then as you go across, the letter on the right would get higher. This was done mainly for security. And I'll show you a whole sheet. This was the whole sheet of stamps. There are only 2 or 3 of these in the world right now that are complete. You'll notice there are 12 stamps across and 20 down. Does anyone know why that might have been? There's a reason for that. Remember, this is pre-decimalization way back in Britain. 12 pennies make a shilling, and 20 shillings going down make a pound. So the sheet would cost 1 pound. So this is an example of printing done for a practical purpose due to size of a lot of different things that are printed. So 7 years later, America decides to jump on board, and we have our first stamps. We actually have 2 first stamps because these came out at the same time. The 5-cent Franklin stamp and the 10-cent George Washington stamp. You'll notice that the 10-cent stamp has a Roman numeral for the 10 instead of the regular 10 that you might expect. No one really knows what it is. I suspect it was for design and space considerations. Yeah. And I don't know if you can see, but at the very bottom, really, really small, you see letters R, W, H, and E. Those were the printers, Ross and Wright, Hatch, and Edson. Another thing about these stamps, the brown stamp looks a little more muddier. That's because the brown ink they used at the time had quartz in it, and it wore down the printing plates. Collectors really prize a nice, fresh-looking 5-cent Franklin. Those are very, very rare and hard to find. You notice these stamps also have cancellation. So what's interesting about postage stamps and printing, among a lot of other things, is that they often get printed many times. You know, there's the initial printing of the stamp. Sometimes there's an overprint, for example, in times of war or inflation, and they have to change the value. Then, of course, as the stamp goes through the mail, it gets postmarked, or in this case, canceled, and this was the cancellation of the time. So they get, in a sense, printed again, and then on the back, they get printed with gum, and then they often get perforated. Perforations didn't come until about 1853 in the U.S. So stamps actually get printed in a way many, many times. So we're moving ahead. This is 1871. This is a Franklin stamp. In the first 50, 60 years of the U.S., Franklin and Washington were used a lot as stamps. Matter of fact, almost all the time for stamps. I think it was more of a cultural thing. So companies would bid. The U.S., the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, did not take over stamp production until 1894. So this is 1871. So private companies are still bidding every few years to get the rights to print the stamps. This stamp was done by the National Banknote Company. Now, 8 years later, in 1879, American Banknote took over, and they wanted, of course, to distinguish themselves. So they decided to add a little something. You see right there, whoops, I did it right there. What they did is just put a little engraver's mark in that pearl right to the left of the one. And that's just so, well, not that people would know in general, but if it ever came down to determining, you know, who made the stamp, they would know. So in some ways it was kind of an inside joke, but in other ways it was a way to say, you know, we made these stamps, even though they took over the dies from National. So moving ahead a little to 1890, these are not the same stamps. They're Franklin blue stamps, but they're not the same stamp as the stamp we just saw. The one on the left was done by American. Remember I said that American Banknote Company had taken over the printing. And the one on the right was done in 1894 by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, because finally for the first time in 1894, the U.S. government, via the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, took over stamp production. They won the bid, and they took over, and they wanted to distinguish themselves too. This is a little bit easier to see. Can everybody see what they did? Up in the upper left and right? They just put in 2 little triangles. So they weren't really trying to be as secretive as American did. Otherwise, it's the same stamp. The color of the paper and the color of the ink was probably due to other reasons. For these particular stamps, it might just be age or sunlight or moisture or things like that. Although certainly during that time, you don't have the consistency that you have in modern eras. So certainly different companies and certainly the government might change inks or change papers due, of course, to cost, because we're all interested in saving money. Moving ahead, even though this says 1892, this stamp was made in 1893. Anybody here from Chicago? 1, 2, okay, the Columbian Exposition, right, late 1800s. And this stamp was done to commemorate that and also to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the U.S. And I just wanted to show you a couple things. One, in this stamp, just look at the engraving. Remember, this stamp is going to be about the size of your thumb, a little bit less. The engraving work that it takes to do something like this, of course, is just really phenomenal. Sometimes there would be variations in stamps, and in this particular case, there's a variation called the broken hat variety. There's a little plate defect, and it's right there. Whoops. Oops, I lost my laser, but anyway, I think you can see it there with the arrow. And there are a number of these defects, but I like this one because it's called the broken hat. Kind of gives a jaunty look there to the explorer. So moving ahead to the 1900s in the U.S., this was the John Erickson stamp, the memorials in Washington, D.C., in Potomac Park. He was the maker of the Monitor, the USS Monitor in the Civil War. And they wanted to honor him. The reason I wanted to show you this stamp, though, is not really because of the stamps, it's because of the selvage or the margin. You'll see the initials AEF. That was Albert E. Fisher. He was the siderographer. Siderographer is the person who takes the transfer plate and actually transfers that to the printing plate. And so about this time, well, actually for probably about 20 or 30 years during this time, on U.S. stamps, you will see a lot of times the name of the printers in the selvage. You'll see the names of the siderographers. You'll see other workers like the plate finishers. You'll see their initials, maybe not their full name on the stamp. And I just think that's really nice, a nice way to kind of to honor your workers. And Albert E. Fisher was also a plate finisher. And so he probably also had his initials on other stamps for doing plate finishing. Okay, moving ahead to 1948 in the U.S. Some of you may have this stamp in your packet. I really like this stamp. Now, modern designers, modern graphic designers like Jonathan Ives at Apple would probably look at this stamp and be absolutely horrified. Obviously, there's just all kinds of stuff going on here, and it's certainly not a contemporary type of stamp. I love it because, well, for one thing, this was sort of the design style of the time, and number two, it's trying to tell a story, just like stained glass windows do in churches, and it's doing this through a number of ways. It's celebrating Fort Bliss's centennial, 100 years from 1948. It's in El Paso, Texas. And in the upper left, you can see the desert area around Fort Bliss. And then in the upper right, you see the mission and a citrus tree down there. Down in the triangle, you see the fort and some troops. You see the rocket. By the way, this is the first rocket that was ever on a stamp. And then you might think, okay, well, there's a lot going on. Actually, there's a lot more, because you may not notice it. But you see that triangle around the stamp? Yeah. If you have the stamp, I know it's kind of dark there. You may not be able to see it with the naked eye. If you have your printer's glass, you may be able to see it. But I'll go a little closer. If we move in, there's a parade going on. And what the designer, Charles Chickering, was trying to do was to show the movement of people and other things into this area during the 100 years. So it starts with people, it goes to a stagecoach, a Conestoga wagon, and then when you get to the end, there's a tank and I think a motorized truck. But what's really neat is right about there, near the top of the rocket, on the left, there's a camel. And this was the first U.S. stamp that had a camel on it. And the reason there's a camel on there is because the U.S. Army wanted to experiment with bringing camels and as beasts of burden into the Southwest, and they did that for a number of years. It didn't work out. The camels didn't like them, and they didn't like the camels too much. So, all right, zooming ahead, a little bit more modern. This is the Bernard Revel stamp. He was a rabbi who was the head of Yeshiva Anniversary. And this stamp is not really so much celebrating him, it's celebrating the 100th anniversary of Yeshiva University in New York. He had been the president there for about 25 years, so they decided to use his image on the stamp. Some of you may have the stamp in your packet. And so, looks like a normal stamp. You normally wouldn't see anything unless you had some magnification. Because if you had some magnification and you looked at the stamp very closely, you would see that the engraver, Kenneth Kipperman, decided to have a little fun. And what he did, right to the right of his beard, he engraved the Star of David. Now, that was not part of the design. He did not have permission to do it. I don't think he got fired. He did get in trouble. Now, stamp collectors, though, love this kind of stuff. You know, stamp collectors get stamps. They get jeweler's loops and pour over them and try to find all kinds of things like this. So he definitely should have done it, but if you have a glass, like I said, I know it's dark right now, you probably can't see it, but you'll be able to see the Star of David. It's kind of faint. What's interesting, normally stamp collectors find these things right away on stamps. This took a whole year to find. And I think the reason is because it's not that well defined. He sort of made it look like the part of the mustache. And zooming ahead even more. So some of you have this stamp, and I call it a stamp. It's really what we call a cut square or an indicia. This was cut from an envelope. The U.S. Post Office, through the printers and through the BEP, make not only stamps, but they also make stamped envelopes and also stamped postcards. Some of you may have bought some before. They're not really too popular, certainly not as popular as stamps. But this was one they did, and it's so interesting because it's actually a hologram. And for those of you who have this one in your packet, you can take it out. And what you have to do, you have to kind of turn it all different kinds of ways. I don't know if there's really enough light, but if you catch the light just right, it'll shine nicely and give you sort of a 3D effect. Holograms are made with lasers, and instead of just bouncing light off one angle of a surface, they bounce light off all kinds of different angles, and that's how you get the 3D effect. Beyond that, I don't know how to make that. But this was a really cool stamp. Okay, so getting back to Britain, they made a 10-pound stamp for big packages about 15 years ago, and they wanted to make it very secure. So there's all kinds of things going on in this stamp. Up and the Queen Victoria image, that's optically variable ink. If you tilt the stamp, it'll change from kind of a light gray to a dark black. Over there on the left, the 10 pounds is actually written in different kinds of lines. And then you have micro printing saying 10 pounds. They added 4 special perforations, elliptical perforations up here, and then 2 down here at the bottom. They embossed the number 10 right here in sort of a braille. And so they were really worried about this stamp, I guess because of the high value of it getting counterfeited. And so that's why they did all those security things. But stamp wasn't really that popular, so they didn't have to worry. Okay, some of you may have this stamp in your packet, Padre Felix Varela. He was a social justice reformer. And when you first look at this stamp, I thought it was etched because of that soft sort of ground. You know, it gives a kind of nice soft appearance, especially in his face and around his face. But actually, that's not how the stamp was made. The stamp was actually lithoed, and it was done all with microprinting. If you squint your eyes you'll see USPS for United States Postal Service. And again, you know, why was this done? Partly for security, partly, I think, to have a little fun, because, of course, now the technology enables it. Some of you have this stamp, Houdini, and this ties in nicely with the conference. So, the Harry Houdini stamp, and it looks pretty normal. Looks like his normal portrait there. But if you had a special decoder from the USPS that works on about 50 or 60 different stamps, and I'm sorry, I've tried other things to see if it works without a special decoder. I've tried plates of glass, I've tried a Coke bottle. Nothing seems to work except a special decoder. But if you have a special decoder and put it over the stamp, what happens is this. Up in the upper two center stamps there, you'll see it looks like Houdini's in chains. And there are a number of other stamps that have these kind of cool features, that if you have the special decoder, you can put it over the stamp, and it'll make the stamp show all kinds of cool little secret hidden things. Okay, moving over to Iceland. These stamps were from Iceland, and these were to, I want to say commemorate or celebrate, but that's not really the word if a volcano blows up in your country, right? But they got these stamps out quickly. This was just, I think, in 2010, I think it was, and in the spring, I don't know if you remember when the big volcano blew there and all the ash went all over. Within that year, just in the fall, they were able to put out some stamps with pictures of the volcanoes. What's really neat about this stamp, though, is that the ink has ash from the volcano, and they added it to the stamps. I tried to get some of these stamps for you. Postal History Foundation said, sorry, we don't have any. Okay. Moving to the current year, 2016. Star Trek, Star Wars nerds here, raise your hand, be proud, all right. 50th anniversary of Star Trek. So the U.S. government put out some stamps real recently, as a matter of fact, I think just a few weeks ago. You can get them at the post office. They're really nice. They're 4 stamps and they're really cool. Canada decided to go all out. They saw that this was just a marketing gift in the making, and they put out, these are just 2 of the stamps, and these are lenticular stamps. Now, some of you have lenticular stamps. I wasn't able to get these 2 stamps, but some of you have some other lenticular stamps. Lenticular stamps, you probably remember if you had those rings out of the Cracker Jack box when you were a kid and you moved them. So lenticular printing can actually do 3 things. Sometimes it just makes an image jump from one image to another. In other words, kind of go back and forth. Sometimes it makes it slowly change from one image to another. And sometimes they look like a hologram. In other words, it's just kind of a 3D effect. It doesn't really change, but you know, if you go like this, it kind of makes the image look 3D. So these 2 particular stamps, the one on the left, the crew transponds, and the one on the right, they're jumping out of the ship, I think it is. And so lenticular printing is done. It has to be very exact. The way I understand it, and please don't ask me any technical questions about it, but the way I visualize it, it's kind of like vertical blinds or those billboards, you know, that change. So what they do, they make the different images in very, very thin little strips. And it has to be very exact and precise, or you kind of get a muddy lenticular effect. But if you do that, and then you put that ridged plastic over it, and as you turn your head, that's how the images change. That's all I can tell you. Okay, so that brings us up to the current year. So why stamps aren't talked about more in the printing world, I'm not really sure. It might be because they're ubiquitous. In other words, we see them so much. It might be because they're kind of fading out right now because we're moving to email and social messaging and that kind of thing. And then, of course, people can do their own printing. Yeah, that's right. We've got Zazzle and Stamps.com. And so people can actually upload the images for a small fee, and you can make your own stamps. So you can put pictures of your dog or your family and make your own stamps. And the U.S. government, of course, is aware of this, and they do support it. So we saw some of the history, and we saw that going back in time, you can see that some of these special effects aren't really new. Some of them go pretty far back in time. But the question is, why is it still being done, and why is it so important? I put together what I feel are a number of reasons. Certainly security, like we saw in the earlier stamps with the engine turnings on the side and the line engraving and things like that. Marketing, desire to be unique and creative. It assists in selling stamps that are never used. So for example, those Star Trek stamps from Canada, they're $5 each for the lenticular ones. A lot of people will buy that special sheet of 2 stamps for $10, and of course they'll never use them. So that results in pure profit for the post office. Competition with other countries. It encourages growth in philately. Philately just means stamp collecting or postal history. Because if you have really cool stamps, then people tend to want to collect them more. And then finally, I sometimes think it's just designers, producers, printers, graphic artists, just sort of having fun, just sort of pushing their limits and just seeing what they can do. Those are my sources. And again, I'd like to thank the Postal History Foundation for your packets of stamps. Please feel free to keep them. And if there's one next to you, feel free to take it. And if there are any questions, I'd glad to take them at this time. Yes.
Actually, I have a question about perforation. I never thought about it until today. I know there were ownership stamps that had perforations that you would see. I don't know when they began, but did that technology really start with stamps, or did that come out of? Can you speak to that at all? I know this isn't as much about the printing or the graphics.
No, that's fine. Actually, it is. So there are actually 2 kinds of perforations. One are the perforations around the stamp. And start in the 1800s, the first perforations that went around the stamps in England and Great Britain. And by the way, the reason I'm not talking about other countries is because each country has its own sort of history. It gets very complicated. That's why I just wanted to stick with these 2. But for the U.S. and Britain, in the 1850s, they started adding perforations to the stamps. Before that, you had to have a pair of scissors, and you would cut the stamps out of a printed sheet. So at first there were separate machines done that perforated the stamps. So in other words, you print the stamps and then you run it through the perforator. In the 1900s, I think around 1910, 1920, you started having these big monstrosities that did everything. So not only printing the stamps, but perforating them and also adding the glue at the same time. And so that's one type of perforation. The other type of perforation is sometimes what would happen for security reasons. You don't see a lot of them, usually just in times of war. And in the U.S., you see them from about the 1920s through about the 1950s. What would happen in order to pre-cancel stamps, a lot of corporations and small governments like cities and counties and states, what they would do is perforate their initials into the stamp. Is that what you're talking about, like more specialized perforations that are actually in the stamp?
I was wondering if stamps actually created the idea of perforation at all, about ripping something away.
Oh.
If that technology began with stamps, or if you could speak to that at all. If not, that's fine. But I was just curious if it had its start with stamps.
Excellent question. Did everyone hear the question? Did perforation start with stamps? I don't know, but I think it did. I think it did in the 1850s because I think there was the need there, and this, fulfilled that need. Other perforations I think were done like with coupons and other tearaway things, but I think that came later. I will find out and email you. I'll let you know. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Modern stamps that are the peel and sticks, they have this kind of fake perforated edge.
Yes.
Is that just stylistic, or?
Thank you so much. Yes, we stamp collectors hate that. So the question is, with peel and stick, why do stamps still have perforation? And the answer is right. They don't need them at all. I think it's just history to make people feel comfortable. In the same way that when the web started gaining traction, what happened? Newspaper columns would be on the web, and they would just sort of be in textual format because they were just sort of mimicking what was in newspapers. So what we stamp collectors like to see, first of all, right, you don't need perforation. Secondly, the peel and stick does make it, and modern technology, make it a lot easier to make different shapes. So when we think of stamps, you know, we think of squares or rectangles. Once in a while, in the past 20, 30 years, they have been some other shapes like triangles or circles. But really now the sky's the limit with technology and with the die cuts. There's really no reason, except you'd have a little maybe extra printer's waste if it was kind of an odd shape. But other than that, there's really no reason. And I wish graphic artists and designers would work, you know, with the USPS and with printers to make all kinds of cool shapes without perforations. Thank you. Yes, way in the back.
Have you had any interest in collecting what would be considered the illegal mail art stamps? You know, artists who put it by the U.S. government, where they created their own versions of stamps. Like, I can't remember the name of one where, for instance, there's a stamp of Lincoln being shot and some other things like that. And now that you're able to design your own stamps, you know, through the use of the computer, I would think they would be very valuable, because at that time people were doing it quite illegally.
Right, excellent question, thank you. So the question is, do I collect the stamps that are done on stamps.com or Zazzle that you can make on your own, that are, let's say, kind of cross the border?
No, I mean before the computer, I'm talking. These were way before the computer.
Yeah,
a group of artists would create stamps illegally and put it on an envelope, and it would go through our systems. And who was that? Yeah, Henry Morris. I mean, they were completely illegal. And I would think now that the government is sort of condoning it because they get a cut of it, actually, I would think those stamps would be quite valuable to collect.
I think they are. They're a niche market. Those particular stamps, like so before computers.
Right.
There is a whole niche area called mail art.
Right.
So it's the stamps, it's the postmarks, it's the postal history marks, it's the envelopes, it's the postcards, and right, some of them, like you said, Lincoln being shot and that kind of thing. They get you know, some of them kind of cross line a little bit. So I've only seen like one or two. Among general stamp collectors, I would say they usually don't collect them. It's kind of a different market, but certainly, you know, we've seen them before, and I think they're great. I think they're really cool. Now with Stamps.com and Zazzle today, they did set some limit. It can't be pornographic and that kind of thing. So, you know, they do review everything that's sent in. They review. At first, I don't think they did. I think they thought, well, nobody will do anything like that. Yeah, I think they learned very good. Yeah. So, yes, sir.
When you looked at that 10-pound stamp that had all of those security features,
yeah.
what's the chance that the postal employee is going to notice any of that?
Very low. Very low. So yeah, so the question is, you know, what's the chance, even with the stamp with all the security features, that post office employee would notice it? Everything is so automated these days that you could probably put, oh my God, is this being recorded? Okay, let me change what I'm going to say. In the past, people have put Christmas seals and things like that on envelopes, and it gets through the mail. And that's because, you know, during Christmas season especially, everything's so automated, a lot of times they don't check, and so it gets through. If it gets through, it's probably not a big deal. Now, if you started doing it regularly, then I think the postal inspectors would start looking into you. The second thing is, although I didn't mention it, most stamps now, all over the world, have some sort of luminescence added to them, some phosphorescence or fluorescence. You don't notice it, of course, but it's there, and when they go through the processing machines, what happens is that helps the machine align the envelope so that the stamp is in the upper right-hand corner, so that it goes through the machine, which is, you know, God, I don't know how much they're doing now, probably about 100 a second. You know, it's stamping the upper right-hand corner of the envelope and not the lower left-hand corner of the envelope. So that's another thing, that if you didn't put a stamp on or a marking with the correct phosphorescence and fluorescence, it may kick it out for a human to inspect it. Anything else?
I think we need to.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, but
Ask a question.
thank you, Rob.